All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm Tierra Curry. I'm a senior scientist in our Saving Life on Earth campaign. I use she pronouns, and I'm joining this webinar from traditional Shawnee lands. On this Saving Life on Earth webinar, we're going to mark Remembrance Day for Lost Species. Lost Species Day is a volunteer-led international day of remembrance for species that we've lost to extinction. You can learn more about it at lostspeciesday.org. This is one of many events that are happening around the planet today. On this one, we're going to honor 11 birds, 8 mussels, 2 fish, a flower, and a bat that were declared extinct this year. They were protected under the Endangered Species Act, and now they're proposed for delisting because they haven't been seen. So it's really sad. It's hard. Talking about extinction is hard. I'm grateful that you joined us tonight because we want to honor these species, but we also want to vow to stop nothing short of ending extinction. So we're going to hear from our Executive Director, Kierán Suckling, and then award-winning author Lydia Millet is going to read to us from her new work. We're very honored to have her on staff here at the center. Then we're going to read elegies for the species that we've lost, and I'll light candles for them. We'll share a moment of silence, and then we'll turn to discussion and have about 20 minutes for your questions and answers at the end. So you can type any questions you have into the Q&A box. With that, I will hand it over to Kierán.
Thanks, Tierra, and thanks to all of you for coming out, for taking the time to mourn with us and remember with us these 23 species. These 23 have been picked because they have been on the Endangered Species List, and the federal government is moving forward with removing them from that list because they are extinct. They're not the most recent species to go extinct, or even the most important species to go extinct, if we can imagine some way of sorting out extinctions by importance. But they are species that we've given up hope of finding, finally. There's species that have passed over from being endlings, the last of their kind, just being the end. And species go extinct every day on the planet, every hour actually. And most times we don't even know these species at all. We haven't seen them, we haven't named them. Some few we have. And we spend decades then trying to find them afterwards.
Kierán, your sound just cut out. All right, sorry about that. I think Kieran's, oh, there you are.
Yeah, pardon me, I just got bumped off there for a moment. I was just saying that, most times we don't know when species go extinct, but when we do find them, when we see that they're endangered, we get really attached to them, we track them, and we can spend decades trying to find them. Many people have spent much of their career trying to find a species that's gone missing, but at a certain point, we have to decide that that's hopeless. And that's the case for these 23 species that we're going to memorialize tonight. I want to start off that by reading a poem from W.S. Merwin that he calls A Coming Extinction. Merwin was a poet laureate of the United States and a good friend of the senator. We did a lot of projects with him together, and he wrote this beautiful poem about the gray whale, and he wrote it in 1969, and that was 2 years after the gray whale was put onto the Endangered Species List, and people had really mostly given up hope that we could save it, and that's the light in which he wrote this poem for Coming Extinction. So it's also good to remember that extinction never never occurred. It went on to Endangered Species List, and because of the work of environmental activists, scientists, agency people, in fact, it was saved. And this is a species which today is in very large numbers in the Pacific Ocean. And that's important to remember here. You know, of all these 23 species that went extinct, virtually no conservation effort was expended to save them, as they just came too early. But of the species what we do try to save, that we do put energy into, we're rarely unsuccessful. And so extinction is something that is not at all inevitable. And that's why we exist as a Center for Biological Diversity. And we hope, you know, you'll join us in that quest to stop the great extinction. So with that, I'll read Merwin's poem for Coming Extinction. He says, "Gray whale, now that we are sending you to the end, that great God, tell him that we who follow you invented forgiveness and forgive nothing. I write as though you could understand and I could say it. One must always pretend something among the dying. When you have left the seas nodding on their stalks, empty of you, tell him that we were made on another day. The bewilderment will diminish like an echo, winding along your inner mountains, unheard by us, and find its way out, leaving behind it the future dead and ours. When you will not see again the whales, calves trying the light, consider what you will find in the black garden and its court, the sea cows, the great ox, the gorillas, the irreplaceable hosts ranged countless and foreordaining the stars, our own deaths. Join your word to theirs. Tell him that it is we who are important."
Thanks, Kierán. And as Kierán said, extinction is not inevitable. We can stop it. I think it's a political choice. And so with all of your help, we're going to end extinction. And I'm going to hand it over to Lydia now to share with us.
All right. That poem always upsets me greatly. So I'm going to pull myself together and read a bit, just about 5 or 6 minutes from a book I'm working on now that hasn't been published yet, which is a nonfiction book, which is unusual for me. It's called We Loved It All. In the beginning, we gave names to all the beasts, the creeping things, the flying things, the things that swam, the creatures of the field. We gave them names, some say, so we might better know them. Home was a garden then, a garden in the wild. Green forests climbed the feet of mountains. Clear rivers ran from ice blue glaciers to the sea. Tall grasses on the prairies rippled like water in the wind. And in the deserts, a hot breeze blew the sands into hills that silently shifted. The animals we named roamed through the forests and the ocean in abundance, more animals than you could ever imagine. We were animals too, so we roamed it with them. And like the other animals, we felt no shame and saw no need to cover our bodies. At first, we were safe in the garden, which was an earthly paradise. We were permitted to eat the fruit of every tree that grew in it, as the story goes, with one exception, the fruit of the tree of knowing good from evil. For even paradise has rules. And if we'd stopped there before we reached for that fruit at the start of it all, showing no curiosity, seeking no knowledge, and content in our innocence and ignorance, we might have been allowed to stay in that beautiful garden. Live in the beginning forever. In the tale of the Garden of Eden, the eating of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil was a sin because it went against the single rule the Creator had then given to his people. When we disobeyed and chose knowledge, we were severed from the rest of the beasts. The Creator, being omniscient, would have known this, as he knew all things, that our choice for knowledge would remove us from the realm of the others he had also created. That this departure, this severance from the other animals, would become our original sin, and that over time, the very nature of that sin would be obscured from our sight. It was knowledge that divided us from our union with the others in the story of Eden. But lately, our knowledge has brought us closer to them again. We've thought up ways to see into the far corners of the land and sea, to cast waves into the ocean that tell us the shape and position of whales and schools of fish, into the air to describe the patterns of storms and ice and fire, into the universe to understand celestial objects we couldn't reach in 1,000 lifetimes. Those ways might be seen as a miracle of creation, even to the faithful as a permission from on high, an act of divine clemency, the chance of an atonement for all the sins of omission and commission our kind has committed against the rest. With our far-seeing, we've given ourselves the chance to use our ability to know, the shimmering privilege that through story and stubborn pride has held us separate from the others for so long, to also be wise and keep them here with us. The love that dare not speak its name, wrote an English poet named Lord Alfred Douglas in 1894. He was referring to romantic love between men, which was then a crime in England. Whatever the flaws and tragedies of language, whatever the pitfalls of disclosure and definition, we have to speak our love to make it real, and speak our loss as well. We have to mourn each disappearance, and no death is greater than an extinction. For in our rush to get past the grief of death, we also rush past the exuberance of being alive. Every life is a jumble of event, swells of drama and stretches of sameness. Some lend themselves to repetition, with bright public flashes of victory and defeat, scandal and conflict, while others unspool along private paths. But none is without story, and no story is without fascination. Held up to the light, each life glitters with the intrigues and crises of selfhood and community. Even in darkness, unseen, a living thing breathes with its own particular glory, its own rhythm of existence, never exactly the same as the next. An extraordinary experience of being, even within a so-called ordinary life. The world of subjectivity beyond the human is also vested with that charismatic gleam and offers to us, when we have the privilege of coming near it, encounters that surpass our understanding. The others are the manifested brilliance of the force that animates us all. We can use the language of mysticism or religion or science to insult or exalt them, but our words remain shadows and light that play over the surface of things and furnish us as we abide on that surface with a complex illusion of meaning. But the truths of sentience persist beyond and beside the symbols we've made, in spaces language can reach for, but never touch. So that humility before nature, as well as what we hold to be divine, is the only wise course left to us. The workings of life across time pre-existed our words and their illusions, and will outlast them by eons, into the swelling and then the dwindling of the sun, and possibly beyond with the rise and fall of numberless other stars. Marvelous and irreducible, those works imbue the universe with feeling and with warmth, the sharp grief and delectation of presence and mortality, the possibility of joy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lydia. I can't wait to read that book. That was perfect. So now we're going to read the elegies for the species that we've lost. And as Lydia said, they all have their own glory, and we kind of just stand before them in humility. Our Nevada director, Patrick Donnelly, and Linda Rico from our Population and Sustainability Program are going to read them for us, and I'm going to show you their pictures. All right.
On the Hawaiian island of Lanai, there used to be a pretty flowering plant in the mint family that lived in steep, wet canyons. It had white flowers that were occasionally tinged with purple. It was so rare and barely noticed that it was only ever assigned a Latin name, Philostegia glabra variation Niensis. It was last seen in 1914.
The Guam bridled white-eye was a little green, yellow, and white bird with a short beak and a distinctive white ring around its eyes. Known as the Nosa by the Chamorro people, it was considered one of the most common birds on the island in the early 1900s, inhabiting forests, grasslands, and even swamps. The accidental introduction of the brown tree snake to Guam in the 1950s marked the beginning of the end for the bridled white-eye. The last individual of the subspecies was seen in 1983, 1 year before it was protected under the Endangered Species Act.
The Kawaii Akihaloa was an olive green, short-tailed Hawaiian honeycreeper that lived only on the island of Kauai. It had an extraordinarily long, down-curved bill, which spanned about a third of its body length, the longest of any Hawaiian songbird. Once widespread in high-elevation forests in Kauai, the Akihaloa was last seen in 1965. It went extinct because of avian disease spread by mosquitoes, moving upslope in a warming climate, and negative impacts of invasive species, including predation.
The little Mariana fruit bat wasn't all that little, actually. It had a 2-foot wingspan, and it loved to dine on tropical fruits. Also known as a flying fox, this bat lived on the island of Guam and was noticeable for the gold on the side of its neck and yellowish brown fur on its head. It was last seen in 1968 and went extinct because of habitat loss, invasive brown tree snakes, and hunting.
The Kawaii O had a distinctive bell-like call that cut through the forests of Kauai. This small black and yellow songbird was common in the late 1800s and considered rare by the 1920s. It ultimately went extinct because of habitat destruction and the introduction of rats, pigs, and mosquitoes. The Kawaii O was the last surviving member of the Mohoidae family, a group of honey-eating birds, and represents the only complete extinction of an entire avian family in modern times. Its call was last heard in 1987.
The southern acorn shell mussel was small, smooth, shiny, and yellow. It lived in freshwater stream riffles in Alabama, Georgia, and Tennessee, mostly in the Coosa River system and the Cahaba River. It was identified as endangered in 1971, but its Endangered Species Act protection wasn't finalized until 1993. Meanwhile, extensive damming of rivers had already driven it to extinction.
The Kawaii Nui was a stout, short-tailed honeycreeper. Males of the species were a stunning combination of bright yellow, olive, and white, and a black mask and bill. The females were mostly olive gray-white with yellowish highlights in the face, wings, and tail. Although there have been sporadic, unconfirmed reports of it over the past century, this bird was likely extinct sometime shortly after 1899, the date of the last confirmed sighting. It was lost due to clearing of its lowland forest habitats for agriculture.
The green blossom pearly mussel was an elusive species, spotted just a handful of times, mostly before 1918. It had an elliptical outer shell, smooth and shiny with fine green rays, and its inner shell varied from white to salmon red. Muskrat middens reveal that the green blossom pearly mussel lived in the Clinch, Powell, Holston, and Nolichucky rivers in Tennessee and Virginia. Dam building ruined some of its most important habitat in the headwaters of the Tennessee River. Then pollution from coal mining drove it over the edge of extinction. It was last seen alive in the Clinch River in 1982.
In former times, a keen listener on the island of Maui would recognize the lovely call of the Maui akepa, a quivering whistle ending in a long trill. Already extremely rare by the early 1900s, This 4-inch dusty green songbird with a small crossbill was seen only once in 1970, the year it was protected, and just 5 times after that. The last sighting was 1988, the last hearing in 1995.
The flat pigtoe mussel inhabited the Tombigbee River in Mississippi and Alabama. It had a preference for clean, fast-flowing water and tended toward shallow stretches of the river, where the bottom was silt-free. The flat pigtoe was just over a couple of inches across, with dark lines on the outer shell and bluish-white inner shells. It went extinct because of dams. The construction of the Tennessee Tombigbee Waterway Lock and Dam System, whose construction began in 1972, sealed its fate. It didn't get protection under the Endangered Species Act until 1987, 7 years after it was last seen.
The Maui nukuputu was a medium-sized yellowish-gray honey creeper with an extraordinarily thin, curved bill, slightly longer than the bird's head. It lived in the wet, high-elevation forests of Maui. Tenacious, this bird used its inch-long bill to peck for weevils, beetle larvae, and caterpillars in the bark of ohia, lehua, and koa trees. It was feared extinct by 1896. A research expedition reported seeing the bird in 1967 in the Kipahulu Valley, but extensive follow-up searches found no trace of it. It was protected in 1970 after it was already extinct.
Small but mighty, the Sammarcos scambusia made its home in a half-mile, slow-flowing section of the upper Sammarcos River in Texas. It was only an inch long and earned its living eating insects. Unlike many other fish, the Sammarcos scambusia gave birth to live young rather than laying eggs. It was already extremely rare by the time it was protected under the Endangered Species Act in 1980 and was last seen in the wild in 1983. Driven extinct by people's overuse of its water.
Kamaao. In the 1880s, the Kamaao was the most common bird on Kauai. Sometimes called the large Kauai thrush, it lived mostly in the forest and feasted primarily on fruit and insects. It grew to be about 8 inches long with a brownish body and gray belly. By 1928, it had mostly disappeared from the island's outer forests, and by 1980, there were just 24 left. The last one was seen in 1987. Extinction was mostly due to habitat loss and introduced mosquitoes.
The Siodo mad tom was a small catfish in Ohio that by day hid under rocks and vegetation and came out at night to feed along the stream bottom. It was last seen in 1957 and went extinct because of agricultural runoff and silt that spilled into Big Darby Creek, where many endangered species are currently under dire threat from sprawl from the city of Columbus that could spoil this very special habitat.
The Puuli, or black-faced honey creeper, inhabited the very wet easternmost side of Maui and was considered an extremely quiet bird. It declined due to habitat destruction by invasive feral pigs and the decline of its favorite food, tree snails, themselves highly endangered. In 2004, the last 3 Puuli were brought into captivity in a last-ditch attempt to save them, but they didn't survive.
The yellow blossom pearly mussel made its home in shallow, fast-moving waterways in Alabama and Tennessee, including in the Cumberland and Tennessee River systems. It had an elliptical shell that was shiny and sometimes honey-colored. A lucky viewer might spot one with green rays shooting across its shell. Lost to dams and pollution, it was last seen in 1967 in the Little Tennessee River before it was protected under the Endangered Species Act in 1976.
Also known as the Molokai creeper, the kakawahie was a striking bird with bright orange or red feathers that some said resembled flames. In fact, Hawaiians traditionally used the kakawahie's bright plumage in the capes of leis of royalty. Its call sounded like someone cutting wood. The bird largely vanished before it could be thoroughly studied. There were a few sightings in the early 1960s, with the last confirmed report in 1963. Extinction was due to mosquito spread, disease, habitat loss, and invasive species.
The upland comb shell rarely exceeded 2.5 inches, and sometimes came in a shape described as rhomboidal. It had a tawny shell that was occasionally sprinkled with small green dots or broken green rays. The upland comb shell was historically found in the Black Warrior and Cahaba River drainages in Alabama and the Coosa River drainage in Alabama, Georgia, and Tennessee. Scientists identified it as endangered in 1971, but it wasn't protected until under the Endangered Species Act until 1993, 5 years after the last live individual was seen. Declining without protection, dams and pollution drove it over the edge.
Bachmanns Warbler was a tiny yellow and black neotropical songbird that summered in forests in the southeastern US and wintered in Cuba. Due primarily to habitat loss from conversion of wetlands and logging of upland forests, it declined dramatically in the first half of the 20th century. It was last seen in the early 1960s before it was protected under the Endangered Species Act in 1967.
The tubercled blossom pearly mussel was once widespread and abundant, making its loss even more tragic because it was known from more than 18 major rivers. It ranged from Ontario, Canada, through 7 states south to Alabama. This 4-inch long, bumpy mussel was wiped out due to dams and pollution from coal mining, logging, industry, and agriculture. But it was last seen in 1969. The Endangered Species Act and Clean Water Act came too late to throw it a lifeline.
The stirrup shell mussel had an elaborate, bumpy, and rigid shell with zigzagging lines. It lived in Alabama in the fast-flowing waters of the Black Warrior and Alabama rivers, as well as in the Tombigbee River in Mississippi. Scientists put it on a list for Endangered Species Act protection in 1971, but it wasn't protected until 1987, 7 years after the last live individual was encountered. Extinction was prompted by dams, river channeling, and sedimentation that smothered its habitat.
The turgid blossom pearly mussel was once relatively common in the clean, fresh waters flowing out of the southern Appalachian Mountains in Tennessee and Alabama, and the Ozarks in Arkansas. It was yellow and fairly small at 1.5 inches. The elliptical males were shaped so differently from the rounder females that scientists once thought they were separate species. It was protected under the Endangered Species Act in 1976, 4 years after it was last seen alive in the Duck River. These mussels could live up to 50 years of age, but were driven extinct by dams that cut off the fast-flowing waters they needed to survive.
The ivory-billed woodpecker was the 3rd largest woodpecker in the world. It graced the old-growth forests of the southeastern United States, an ecosystem so stunning it rivaled the redwoods in splendor. With a 30-inch wingspan and nasal-sounding call, like a tin horn or clarinet, the last verified sighting of our country's largest woodpecker was in 1944. The Chicago Mill and Lumber Company knowingly felled the last of its habitat, driving the magnificent bird to extinction.
Thank you. Now we'll take a moment of silence to reflect on these species. Extinction is sad, and I'm really grateful that you all joined us tonight to honor these species. And now we're going to have a discussion and answer your questions, and we're going to talk about the awesome work that we're doing with your support to end extinction, to make sure that we never have to have this mass event for 23 species again. Scientists say that 1 million species around the globe are at risk of extinction right now. But that does not have to happen. We can switch the narrative and say, we saved 1 million species from extinction. And that work starts right here, right now. Like, we work around the clock, basically, because this isn't just a job for us, it's our passion to make sure that we don't lose any more species. So I'm gonna take your questions. Kierán, this first one is probably for you. I love it. Our members are definitely optimists. There's questions about the possibility that the ivory-billed woodpecker or Bachmanns Warbler still exist, particularly in Cuba.
Yeah, there are questions. And with the ivory bill, there was hope about a decade ago when a sighting was reported, and millions of dollars were spent afterwards. That was here in the US, both to protect the habitat where it was seen and to hopefully find it again, but it was not found, and most scientists come to conclude that sighting was not, in fact, a valid sighting. Now, Cuba is less intensely birded than the U.S., and the last sighting in Cuba was later than here in the U.S. So there is more possibility that it could be found there. But nonetheless, it's a very large bird, very striking, a very loud bird from its pecking at trees. And so the likelihood that it still exists even in Cuba with no one seeing it is just, it's not very high. And then Bachmanns Warbler, another species that occurs not just here, but in Cuba. It's kind of the same story. There is a possibility, but after all these decades of not seeing it and pretty intense effort, I think it does make sense to conclude that it's extinct. That doesn't really alter protective efforts, because the SA and US law, of course, doesn't extend to Cuba. But in making these very, very difficult decisions that no one wants to make, they get delayed for years, and rightfully so. And making that call is not just a matter of time. There are other species that have not been seen for 100 years, which have not yet been declared extinct. And that's because, unlike the warbler and the woodpecker, there have not been extensive survey efforts. There's not been a good understanding of their habitat, and consequently, those have not been removed from the list. So you never say never, and we never should, but I do think we have to admit that it's time to declare these species extinct. And I will point out, after species have been declared extinct, they have been found in the past. So there will be people who will keep looking, and God love them and speed them along. But we also need to recognize where we're at from a conservation point of view, because if we don't make that call, another thing happens, which is people think, oh, well, extinction's not happening, right? Well, that's where we land today.
And we certainly hope that they will be seen again. And if they are, then they'll qualify for emergency protection. And we'll all celebrate. We'll have a celebratory webinar.
Yes, we'll play this webinar in reverse.
Yes. Someone asked why we're focusing so much on freshwater mussels and Hawaii birds. And That's because these 23 species are the species that the Fish and Wildlife Service is proposing to remove from the Endangered Species Act for extinction. And they're also the leading edge of the extinction crisis in the United States. Species in Hawaii, birds, plants, snails, are very highly endangered, and so are freshwater mussels, particularly from the southeastern United States. We've lost 36 species of them to extinction. We've lost 71 species of spring snails. So that's why we're focusing on this group tonight. Is there any way to facilitate or speed up ESA listings? It appears that the current system is useless to many species. Kierán, do you want to take that one, or do you want me to take it?
Sure. Well, there is. You could start a conservation group and call it the Center for Biological Diversity. This is something we have specialized in fairly uniquely and put tremendous effort in since our beginning 33 years ago, because we realized that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was delaying the protection of these species illegally because it's politically contentious to protect them. And so we've made that a centerpiece of our work. That's why we have so many scientists researching these species and so many attorneys suing the agency when it fails to protect them. And that's something that's pretty unique to the center. About half of all species that have been protected under the Endangered Species Act since 1989, when we were created, have been due to work by the center. But it's a very important thing, and we do that work not just through the litigation research, but also lobbying for more money for the agency to be able to do this work. But unfortunately, what we found is the more money the agency has, the more it spends with each decision. And so it just triple the amount of money it has, it triples the expense that it takes to list a species. And so that has not been sufficient. And we're currently negotiating with the agency to speed up the listing of over 250 endangered species. And so we may conclude that in coming weeks or months and at least get those ones queued up.
Someone asked how long it takes for a species to get on the endangered species list. And unfortunately, it takes an average of 12 years. Like the monarch butterfly, we petitioned for it in 2014, and the Fish and Wildlife Service isn't going to make a decision until 2024. More than 45 species have gone extinct waiting to get on the list. So we're doing everything we can to speed up that process. And the Fish and Wildlife Service can just add species to the endangered species list of their own accord. They can put them on the candidate list and then propose them. They can emergency protect them. There's lots of ways that it could be direct. But because of political interference with the Endangered Species Act, that doesn't happen. So that's one of the things that we work to combat. Patrick, I know that you weren't really expecting to answer a question, but somebody asked about how we balance renewable energy development with the risk of extinction for endemic species. Do you want to touch on that real quickly?
Yeah, sure. We face twin crises right now globally. We face the climate crisis, of course, because of our energy production and consumption systems, but then we face the extinction crisis. And tonight we're commiserating on some of the victims of that extinction crisis. There are technologies and there are ways of consuming and interacting with energy that that can address the climate crisis while not exacerbating the extinction crisis. So I saw the question there was for Team's buckwheat, a rare little wildflower that's threatened by a lithium mine here in Nevada. And, our basic argument is, we can't solve the climate crisis by making the extinction crisis worse. If we're going to permit a lithium mine to solve the climate crisis that's going to drive a rare wildflower extinct, then are we really solving anything? So supporting renewable energy, supporting lithium and the renewable energy transition doesn't mean supporting it everywhere, every time, regardless of the consequences. And I think that's really our stance, that we are pushing for renewable energy transition across the country, done the right way, and pushing for policy initiatives and planning so that we can do that transition without continuing to drive the extinction crisis, because you'll see so many of our species we were memorializing this evening, were destroyed because of our energy production systems. And that's why they went extinct. And so we need to change the course of that, not just of the type of carbon emissions we're making, but of the interaction we have with the natural world and with the rare species that create biodiversity that makes life on Earth possible.
Thanks, Patrick. There's so many great questions. I'm going to take a quick, easy one. It says, for the birds, are their calls recorded so that we at least have that preservation? Yes, for some of them. You can look up Bachmanns Warbler. Someone actually compiled all of the recordings of it. And I thought about playing that on the webinar tonight. But if you just look them up individually, some of them are out there. Lydia, somebody asked what your book is going to be called and when it's coming out.
So this particular book, I'm not sure when it's going to come out. It's called We Loved It All. And I have a novel coming out before this one that also touches on matters of extinction and birds specifically. And it's called Dinosaurs, and it's coming out next year. But I'm not sure when this one will come out. It'll be sometime in the future. Thanks for asking.
Someone also asked about the poem Kierán read. It's by W.S. Merwin. It's called For a Coming Extinction. Is that right, Kierán?
Yeah.
Someone asked about, it said the big cause of extinction seems to be habitat loss, and is returning native plants to the landscape useful? So the primary drivers of extinction now are climate change, habitat loss, invasive species, pollution, human overpopulation, and overutilization, direct exploitation. And so, yes, returning native plants to the landscape is incredibly important. We've already changed so much habitat that we need to protect all the habitat that's left and then work to restore the habitat that can be restored. And people can play a huge role in that by transforming their yards, planting pollinator gardens, planting native plants for the birds, especially as so much of the landscape is developed. The things that individuals do can make a huge difference. But at the same time, we also need policy changes like the America the Beautiful initiative that would protect 30% of US lands and waters for wildlife by 2030 and hopefully half by 2050. So individual actions in restoring the landscape are super important, but we also ask that you take the big policy actions so that we can end extinction and protect a lot of habitat. The next question, I have a lot of thoughts about this one. I get this question a lot. Isn't extinction a normal process? Isn't it true that over 90% of all species on Earth aren't here anymore? And I think I've heard like 99%. Yes, it is true, but for me, it's not relevant. Those species were here millions, billions of years ago. We're here now. The fate of all wildlife is in our hands now. So it's not relevant to me on a daily basis that 90% of things that lived 6 billion years ago, 3 billion years ago aren't here anymore. What's relevant to me is what I can use my time, my energy to try to create space for so that we're not wiping them off the planet. Kierán, do you want to touch on this too?
Yeah, and one way to think about this is to put in the context of speed, right? So it's natural that every human being dies. Death is natural. But what if every human being was dying by the age of 30? Right, that speed of death would tell us there's a problem, even though death is natural. And so similarly for extinction, if scientists have calculated kind of the natural rate, right, without human intervention. And the natural rate of extinction in the United States would be about one species per every 700 years. And instead, just look here, we're talking about 23 species, all of which, went extinct over a period of about 50 years. So it's the speed that is unnatural, not the event itself.
There are a lot of questions about specific work the center is doing for particular groups of species, such as Hawaii species, freshwater mussels, vaquita porpoises, bees. It's awesome that you all are interested in those in particular. The shortest answer is yes, we're working to save all of those groups. We've secured Endangered Species Act protection for about a dozen freshwater mussels. We're working on more. We're working to stop threats to their habitat. We have a whole program in Hawaii and Nevada. Our environmental health program is very focused on pollinators and bees and reducing the threat that pesticides pose to them, and also getting Endangered Species Act protection for them. The vaquita porpoise, there's only about 10 of those left. Our international program is working to help save them. It is tragic, but I do think that they're still savable, and we are one of the groups that push strongly for a ban on fishing in their habitat. I don't know if anyone, Kierán, Lydia, Linda, Patrick, do any of you want to comment on any of those groups of species?
Well, I'll also note that we got a bill introduced in Congress this year by Rule Grijalva, which would provide $25 million for 5 groups of the most imperiled species in the country. And so one is southwestern fish, another is butterflies, another is southeastern aquatics. So we heard about all the mussels today. Fourth is Hawaiian birds, and then finally Hawaiian plants. And so we're seeking an extra $5 million and a sort of marching orders to the federal agencies to prioritize these because they are so endangered.
That's called the Extinction Prevention Act, and it looks like it's going to move forward and provide vital funding to intervene and help recover these species. Which leads to the next question: what are some of the regulations that go into place to protect species once they end up on the endangered species list? And so they're protected, their habitat is protected, but even more importantly, they get a recovery plan that outlines the actions that are needed to save them and how much those are going to cost. And so once they have a recovery plan, it provides this macro level chance that their situation is going to improve. It also means that federal agencies are required to consult with the Fish and Wildlife Service for any federally permitted or funded project that could harm an endangered species. And this ends up playing a key role, especially with public lands, because unfortunately our public lands are largely managed for fossil fuel extraction and livestock grazing and not for habitat protection. And so one of the acts that we're pushing is the Extinction Crisis Emergency Act, because hopefully that would help overhaul the management of public lands to prioritize biodiversity protection and carbon sequestration. Kierán, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I just also note that the Endangered Species Act, it's really probably the strongest environmental law in the world. And when we fully implement it, when we implement it on time, it's incredibly successful act. And so it's just such a shame that we have this incredible tool, but yet the federal agencies, the state agencies just continue to bow to political pressure from developers, oil and gas companies, loggers, miners, etc., to not use this incredibly powerful law, and often only use it when they're dragged kicking and screaming to do so. And that's why it's so important that there are conservation groups like the center, but also many, many others throughout the entire country, because it just doesn't matter how good your laws and policies are on paper if they're not actually implemented. And that's where conservation groups come in.
Somebody asked for suggestions for reading material for young adults who want to learn more about advocating for species biodiversity and protection, and what kids and their families can do to help. Lydia, would you want to take this one? You're on mute.
Yeah, no, sorry, it's just taking me a minute there. Gosh, no, I don't, I mean, reading is one thing, and then, you know, taking action is another thing. I mean, I actually think that children of a certain age can absolutely read, you know, the Merwin poems that Kierán, you know, quoted. I wrote a book for young adults about climate change that was sort of like a dystopian thing that used that poem as the epigraph, called Pills and Starships, but I wouldn't recommend it for little children. So, I mean, I think any reading that really is about empathy or the natural world or animals, and there's so much fiction about animals. I mean, animals are everywhere, right? In children's fiction and children's stories, picture books and otherwise. I think that children are sort of automatically pulled toward animals and the whole world beyond humanness, right? And it's when we sort of grow up, as it were, that we sometimes become distant from that world that we loved as children. And then in terms of family action, I mean, I don't know, I have friends whose kids are involved in Extinction Rebellion, but again, that's usually teenagers. So I don't know, Kierán, do you have any ideas on that?
Yeah, I mean, there is, you know, a real strong youth movement today around climate. You know, there is the Sunrise movement, which has a lot of room and emphasis on younger kids. And Extinction Rebellion is focused directly on extinction, very important, and that's been really spreading across Europe more rapidly than the U.S., but it is here in the U.S. as well. And so there are ways that kids can get involved, and you know, and I think in doing so, are not only protecting the species, but are just, you know, learning an incredibly important lesson that we all have to become activists ourselves, finally, to save this planet. Someone else is not going to save it for us.
And you know what, I'm also thinking, there are these like sort of movements, and there's sort of large sort of activism, but there's also like so much that kids and families can do locally. And I think that stuff, hands-on, like sort of wildlife stuff, is some of the best, you know, things that you can do with your children. So whether it's like, if you live on a coast and it's like sea turtle egg protection, or you know, you're helping to just clean litter out of an urban park where wildlife comes, you know, there's just so many things, so many direct ways to, or you're helping survey for birds or whatever as a family. There's so many things, I think, that are really hands-on that kids can really get into and can bring them away from their screens and closer to the real world.
And one of our staff members, Stephanie Feldstein, wrote a book called An Animal Lover's Guide to Changing the World. So that's a great resource regardless of your age. There's a lot of great questions. We're not going to get to all of them, but if you really want an answer to your question, feel free to email me, tcurry@biologicaldiversity.org, and I'll do my best to get back to you in a timely manner. I want to take a question. Someone asked about suggestions or personal practices that we use to help ourselves through this process. I'm assuming they're meaning like the extinction grieving process and coming to work every day in the middle of a climate crisis and biodiversity crisis, and how we can support one another. And the second part of that question is my answer. I keep going because of the wonderful people that I work with, and they inspire me every single day. And the antidote to despair for me is hope and action, because it is overwhelming. So I just do what I can and try to get other people to do what they can. Do any of you guys want to comment on that, your personal practices?
Yeah, know here that you know, Ed Abbey once said that sentiment without action is the ruin of the soul. And I think he was exactly right on by that. And what I mean by that is that, I'm often asked, well, how do you, go to work? How do you proceed, given how difficult everything is? But that whole question gets things in reverse, really, because it's by taking action that I get hope. I don't feel hope and therefore take an action. It's quite the opposite. It's by being active, by working with the species, by doing things to help them, that I start to feel hope. Hope is not an idea that will come to you. It's something that arises out of your body and your practice as you do work. So the greatest antidote to despair is not finding some idea of hope. It's just simply taking action. And all of a sudden you'll find you feel much more hopeful, and you'll meet a lot of really interesting species and really interesting people, and have a lot of fun doing that work.
Thanks, Kierán. And we've never asked for donations during one of these webinars before, but today is Giving Tuesday, and we have a unique opportunity because all your donations will be matched. And so one thing that you can do to help fight extinction is donating to this center. We're going to put a link in the chat. It's biologicaldiversity.org/SLOE. That stands for Saving Life on Earth. And again, anything that you donate on Giving Tuesday will be doubled to help us continue this work to fight extinction. If you want to take action, an action alert to help support the Extinction Crisis Emergency Act, you can go to savelifeonearth.org. And there's all kinds of resources on there on ways to get involved in fighting extinction. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. And thank you to our panelists and our digital team. And thank you for your support, because we really couldn't do this work without you. All right, take care.